I'm Mike Slicker, and this is Pinellas Pass. Boot on your screens a minute ago has been a landmark here in Pinellas County for years and years. I know that when I'm in the car with my kids going up to Booker Creek Park to have a picnic, when we go by County Road 584 and McMullen Booth Road, the kids hang out the window and look and giggle and wonder who's the big fella who lost his boot out there. And I talked with a girl the other evening who goes to school over at University of South Florida, and she mentioned the fact that she never would have found the university over there winding through the back roads of Pinellas if it hadn't have been for the boot alongside of the road out there. The interesting fact to me, the especially interesting thing, is that that particular boot, as well known as it is to us here in Pinellas County, is probably equally well known elsewhere around the world. And as a matter of fact, with a strange twist, that same boot is responsible for the University of South Florida being the Golden Brahmins. For about a quarter of the century, the ranch out there supplied much of the world's Brahmin cattle, the stock-bred cattle. And the man that we have with us today, Mr. A.D. Boyd, is indeed the man who wears those boots. He's the owner-operator of Boot Ranch. We'll be here with Mr. Boyd the rest of the show, but first of all, we're going to hear from our pioneer editor, Charlie Jones.
Thank you, Mike, and hello all in TV land. We are glad to bring to you history in the news. This is a time of year when elections are in the forefront of our minds. Present-day politicians are working hard to obtain votes leading to their election. In choosing our elected officials, we often think of the many bills offered to the legislative process, such as tax reform in Tallahassee and in Washington. Let us look at some of the political news from 70 years ago in 1916. Headlines state that Congress wants to clean the slate for campaign. To accomplish this, United States Democrats and Republicans were to have a joint conference to expedite the important legislature so Congress could adjourn for the political campaign. The Democrat Steering Committee had decided on a program which would hold the Senate in session 9 hours daily until it completed the Army and Navy Appropriations Bill, the Revenue and Shipping Bill, Child Labor and Corrupt Practice Measures, listed as imperative legislation. The general sentiment of the Republicans seemed to be against a filibuster on the revenue and shipping bills, and the days continued to pass. A compromise sorts did occur. Although a further conference between the House and Senate was necessary to present a final approval, and general figures of military preparedness were, and I'll give you these figures: Army, $314 million, Navy, $315 million, fortifications, $25 million, military academy, $2 million. The Senate exceeded the House version by $131 million. This excess was in part caused by a $2 million appropriation for the relief of families of the guardsmen and regulars in the Mexican emergency. No family was to get more than $50 a month, however. In another area, the U.S. Advocate General ruled that the state soldiers were not subject to duty outside the United States unless and until they were drafted by order of the President. He also ruled that they were under the control of the federal government and not the respective state governments, and that they were entitled to the same pensions and privileges as the regulars. And that's the way it was with part of the political news 70 years ago. And back to you, Mike.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you very much indeed. We're back here with Mr. Alfred Boyd, the owner and operator of the Boot Ranch. And Mr. Boyd himself has made a study of the cattle ranching industry here in Florida. And let's back up for a moment, Mr. Boyd, and can you tell us how cattle ranching actually got started here in Pinellas County?
Well, it's a long story, but I'll try to make it short as possible. When Florida was admitted as a state, after being a territory, about the only industry in Florida was the poor farmers, some timber operations, and communications were very, very poor. The only improvements and modernization at all came along the seacoast. Mm-hmm. Back from the seacoast, the farmers, not having supplies, had to grow their own garden vegetables. They had to produce their own meat. So most every farmer had a small herd of cattle, not only for meat, but he would pen them at night to collect the fertilizer for his garden, because commercial fertilizer was not available. Communications did not improve for many years, but the herds of cattle improved and grew. And as they grew, it took more care for the animals. The people that are producing these cattle learned to control them with cow whips. Mm-hmm. And that is the place that Florida Cracker got his name. Mm-hmm. And I think that perhaps your viewers would like to see an authentic cow whip. That is 16 feet in length. It's braided one whip across the other until they get the size and the taper that they want. Mm-hmm. This cracker is made of Indian tan buckskin, and it is possible to make these out of horse's tail hair or many other modern fabrics. Mm-hmm. But the cracker here is where the Florida Cracker received his title, the Florida mm-hmm. Cracker.
And you've obviously used this. What sort of things can you do with it? I mean, or could a cracker do with it?
Well, for instance, when I was about through work and on the way home on County Road 77, known as the East Lake Road, right there at Brooker Creek Bridge, I'd pull the whip down and I'd pop it one time. Now, I say pop the whip because people from the north called it cracking a whip, but the Florida Cracker spoke of it as popping a whip. I would pop this whip at the Brooker Creek Bridge, and my mother over on the Curlew Road at our old home place would start supper. Mm-hmm. When I'd get there, my dinner was ready.
Mm-hmm. You could hear it that far away then.
I have positive proof that this whip has been heard for 7 miles.
My goodness.
But now that goes back to the early Florida history. Up until recent years, we had a great deal of pine timber in this area. Pinellas County received its name because of the pine timber here. Mm-hmm. Now, with the pine timber, this will make a far greater noise than any shotgun. And with the pine timber, it reverberates from one tree to the next for miles and miles. Mm-hmm. Besides being a signaling device, when you're out on the open range like we used to have, you had to supply your own meat. Well, riding along, you see a squirrel or rabbit along about lunchtime or evening, pull down on this whip, cut his head off, and you were ready for another meal. Now that is just an idea of what it can be used for.
Mm-hmm. Excuse me, is it easier to use in the pinelands too? Is it easier than a lariat, for instance?
Well, you wouldn't replace a lariat with it at all. Mm-hmm. The lariat serves a purpose for catching the cattle. Now, in Argentina, they have a device with two little balls on the end of a rope they throw and wrap around the legs of the animal and throw them. But we do not practice that in this country. Now, this also is used for an unruly animal. If the bull is unruly, you can usually conquer him very easily with a whip.
Well, back in coming forward, I guess, a little bit then, when you got involved in the cattle industry, I guess it was actually your father before you who had begun to raise the cattle and that sort of thing, Mr. Jesse Boyd. And along about what time did he begin to assemble a herd? Or is that the right thing to say in Pinellas?
Yes. My dad, Jesse Boyd, came here in '84, I believe, and he had schooling up until college age at Sylvan Abbey Log School. When he started in Southern College, located in Sutherland, Florida, which is now Palm Harbor, he opened a meat market and a delivery service for the outlying areas, because a lot of the people moving to the edges of the town did not have refrigeration and their meat supply was nil. So he would peddle meat in a buggy drawn by 2 horses. He managed the market and peddled meat, and also made enough of that to pay 2 sisters' way through school at the same time he was in college. And I don't know just the exact date of Southern Seminary burning, but I can remember it distinctly. I think it was about 1918. It was a tremendous wooden building and made a flame that you could see for miles and miles. It was made of the heart of the southern longleaf pine, and it made a wonderful fire.
So that's about the time that he began to assemble the herd and began to acquire some of the land on which to put them, right?
He did not acquire land to speak of at that time, except for a small citrus grove or 2. He did start buying cattle and slaughtering himself, then cutting up the quarters into usable cuts for the consumer. And he continued in that business up until, I would say, in the early 40s. He had a slaughterhouse on the Curlew Road, and as he would slaughter cattle, he would buy entire herds all over the state, ship in here or drive into Pinellas County. We had an unloading pen at Palm Harbor area, right at the town of Ozona. And they were there until 5 or 6 years ago, and they were finally wrecked. And he continued to increase the size of his herd, but we had no land at that time. He and the other cattlemen, increasing their herds of cattle, used the open, free range. All the towns were fenced to keep the livestock out. When you went to town, you had to get out of the gate, get out of the buggy and open the gate to drive in. Likewise when you're leaving. And inside the towns, each home was fenced. When Dunedin was incorporated about 1888, somewhere in that neighborhood, the first ordinance that was passed by the town council was to confine the hogs to keep them from roaming the streets of Dunedin.
My goodness. We need to take a break right here, Mr. Boyd, and we'll be back in a moment to learn a little bit about the cattle industry after the fencing laws took effect. We'll be right back.
The Pinellas County Historical Society wishes to invite you to attend the 9th Annual Country Jubilee on Saturday, October 25th from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. on the grounds of Heritage Park. Being one of the largest arts and crafts festivals in the Tampa Bay area, it features 125 craftspersons and 6 well-known antique dealers with articles for sale. Continuous entertainment from the bandstand will offer bluegrass music, cloggers, square dancers, and special entertainment for children. Children will also enjoy clown face painting and the petting zoo. Food and drinks will be sold on the grounds. The park's 14 historical buildings will be open to visitors with demonstrations of turn-of-the-century skills being performed throughout the day. Admission is absolutely free, however donations are appreciated. All proceeds from the Country Jubilee are used to benefit Heritage Park, which is located at 11909 125th Street North in Largo. Hope to see you there.
Hello, we're back again with Mr. Boyd, and I'm holding in my hands here the original Boot Ranch brand. Mr. Boyd, can you tell me how the brand came to be and how the ranch came to have the name in the first place?
Well, to begin with, this brand was used for many years before the Boot Ranch was named that. My dad had purchased a herd of cattle about the north end of Lake Tarpon. This old German owner had used this outline of a foot for a brand, but everyone called it a boot. My dad used that for years. When my dad passed away in June of 1950, I took over the brand from with the consent of the other heirs, and about that time we established what is known as the Boot Ranch by name. Mm-hmm. We had had the property for some time, but had never called it a ranch. And in acquiring this property, my dad had started me off when I was about 6 years old, well, about 10 years old, helping him a little bit, marking and branding the calves. He'd give me a heifer calf each year. By the time I was of age, I had a nice herd of my own cattle. And one day we were talking, and he said, "Son, if we stay in the cattle business, we're going to have to own our lands." So I agreed with him. And just about that time, an attorney in St. Petersburg offered us 5,000 acres of land in Pasco County for $3 an acre.
My goodness.
So we went to the bank. After talking with this man, we agreed to purchase it. We went to the bank and offered our security. First National Bank of Dunedin at that time was one of the oldest banks in the area. They said, "Your security is perfect." I offered to mortgage my cattle, what little land I had and all. They said, "Your security is perfect, but the Bank of Dunedin doesn't have $15,000.
Oh my God.
That was the early
year?
30s.
Early 30s, yes.
Right in the height of the Depression.
That's right.
So they agreed to let us have half the money, and the president of the bank went with us to the Exchange National Bank in Tampa to get $7,500. That was our first purchase of land. The next purchase of land came succeeding years until 1942. The St. George Fechtig estate became available. A packing company in Dade City purchased the groves, and we purchased the wildlands where our cattle had been grazing for many years as a free range. At my dad's death, the same month, June of 1950, the state passed a no-fence law. You could not let your cattle roam at large. So my dad and I were just ahead of the state a little bit. So we were prepared to an extent, but I had to build that year 21 miles of fence to keep our cattle on the lands that we controlled. And in doing that, we were acquiring more land all the time. And about 39, the Army called me. I went into the service. Volunteered first to leave Pinellas County. I soon got into manufacturing leather goods in the service. And the money I would send home, my attorney in Clearwater had authority to write checks on my account for any land available in northeast Pinellas County, known as East Lake area now. And we built up the ranch. As my dad was purchasing the Fechtig estate, I was purchasing on my own the Scott estate, which encompassed land in north of Oldsmar and a portion of Oldsmar. And we built it up until we had a pretty solid holding. And that we didn't own, we leased or looked after the property for the use of it. So it made us a usable ranch. And after my dad passed away, while he was on his deathbed, he said, "Son, I'm going to have a sign painted on this new truck I've ordered, a large cattle truck, the Big Boot Ranch." So he didn't get to enjoy the truck. He passed away, and I purchased the truck for the estate and was using it. We had a field of 300 acres in northeast Pinellas County in watermelon. Tremendous field. Oh, I had to use the truck for that, and we need a little advertising on it, so I hired this sign painter to paint the Boot Ranch on there. Now, bear in mind it had never been known as a boot ranch before. That in the painting of that sign, I asked this sign painter to design an entranceway sign for the ranch. He came up with a pencil sketch of this boot sitting on a mound of dirt. I bought it immediately. Asked him to build a boot. He said, "Well, I can't build it except in fiberglass." I said, "Well, I like it in cement." He said, "I can't do cement work." So I agreed with him. He made the boot in fiberglass. It lasted about 2 years and went bad. So I took the remains of that, my own boots, and all the pictures I could find to a welding shop in Dunedin. We made the framework of the boot, set it on the pedestal, then I had a concrete mason to come and plaster that 3 inches thick on all the galvanized metal. And today it doesn't even have a pin crack in it. It needs painting badly. And as I understand it, they hope to keep that as a symbol for a shopping center.
Oh, my goodness. But going back for a minute to the ranch, obviously you and your father were had well anticipated the fencing laws and all of that sort of thing. You anticipated something else too, and in fact brought the Brahman cattle to this area in a very early time and continued to develop the breed. First of all, when was it that you actually brought the Brahman cattle onto the ranch?
We would purchase bulls of the Brahman breed all through the 30s. And the main qualities that we found in the Brahman breed.
That was my next question. Good.
I anticipated that. Chickens, grain, anything that you can name today, it is a hybrid. Well, now the cross of a Brahman bull with the female of the European varieties, such as a Hereford, Angus, and Charolais, and those, when you cross, you get a true hybrid. And the offspring of that hybrid is better than either parent, giving you an average of 100-pound gain in an 8 months old weaning calf. 100 pounds of good red edible meat. Plus the fact that the hybridization of the cattle maintained the ability to be resistant to insects and heat. You never see a Brahman animal go to a shade. They lie right down in the hottest sun. They're highly resistant to ticks and flies, not immune, but highly resistant. The Brahman is the only cattle in the world that can sweat. You run a Brahman and he will sweat like a horse. That sweat is an oily secretion that tends to reject the insects.
Okay. And how is it different to raise Brahman cattle than any of the other cattle breeds? Are there particular and peculiar differences?
They can make the living where other cattle starve to death. They can eat oak leaves or pine bark and thrive on it.
Yes.
But now,
and you were, well, at one time you were president of the Southeastern Brahman Cattle's Association as well.
Yes, sir.
And at that time you had a lot to do with the exporting of the cattle here from Florida. And you were also involved in something called the Florida International, you're going to have to help me.
The Trade Council.
Trade Council, yes, exactly. And that too grew up here in Pinellas County.
Well, now, that Trade Council was not my idea. That was Clyde J. Keyes, the clerk of the Circuit Court of Pinellas County at one time. And he, at that time, was president of the Brahman Breeders Association of the Southeast. Mr. Keyes passed away, and I succeeded him as president of the Southeastern Brahman Breeders Association. And I continued to push his ideas of a trade organization to push the export of Brahman cattle. We were not too successful in getting help there, so we enlisted aid of all producers of farm product and equipment. And finally, an organization was formed, and I refused to take any part in it, but I instigated the idea only.
And
to promote
that was
the breed,
an idea to bring international trade here to Florida.
Now, Doyle Connor, our Commissioner of Agriculture at the time.
And the, well, you were talking about Mr. Doyle Connor, who went ahead and did all of that. I wanted to talk a little bit more personally for a minute and talk a little bit about your leather work in the few remaining moments. One of the things that a lot of the people may not realize is that all of the Western gear and tack that was part of the boot ranch was manufactured there on the ranch. And indeed, you yourself are quite a leather artisan. And this is a bag that you did at one point, and this is a wide belt, and this is an interesting little thing here. And just the few remaining seconds that we have, what can you tell us a little bit? There's an interesting story that goes with it.
This is an alligator work. The alligator was killed in Lake Tarpon. I made a Western saddle, an English saddle, and all the equipment to go with it of alligator hide. It was killed in Lake Tarpon. It took several hides to make it all up, but this is one of the smaller hides. And it was tanned at Tarpon Springs. We had one of the world's finest tanneries in Tarpon Springs. And they tan for many of the big manufacturers of shoes, for instance. And this is part of their work. And I manufactured this in 1939, and it's been around my shop ever since.
And these are actually done with, this is carved leather, you said?
That is carved leather, and it is actually, design is actually cut into the leather and then shaded and trimmed up a little bit, but that's a solid piece of leather, and that's what they call a kidney belt for truck drivers and heavy equipment operators. And we made luggage. Could you take that out and show?
I wish we could. We really don't have any time.